Second Lady Usha Vance kicked off her first national initiative focused on reading today in Loveland. WLWT News 5's Todd Dykes was there and has this report.
There was a moment when the public caught a fleeting glimpse of the still and silent strain between Usha Vance and JD Vance, the Vice President, and his wife, when she spoke quietly of how the ground under their feet shifted so suddenly that she felt unmoored. That sense of disorientation speaks not simply to change, but to the shock of hardship entering what had seemed a stable private world. The marriage, once built on shared law school ambitions, cross-cultural ties, and the promise of a partnered future, is here revealed in a different light, a landscape altered by high-stakes politics, personal imperatives, and unspoken fractures. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Their journey began in a place of common intellectual ground and optimism. Usha, the daughter of Indian immigrants, steeped in law and scholarship, meeting JD at Yale Law School, two ambitious lives colliding in an unlikely partnership. But over time, what began as a shared mission quietly turned into a contest of roles and expectations, with the larger world crowding in. When JD's trajectory moved quickly from private citizen to senator to vice president, the life they had built together was suddenly forced into a new shape, and Usha found herself navigating changes she neither requested nor fully anticipated. Part of the hardship she confronted emerged from transition, the shock of being told about major decisions in the marriage not as a partner in planning but as a passenger. What it feels like to awaken one morning and find one's familiar rhythms dissolved, to move hotel rooms at the last minute, to adapt to Secret Service details, to occupy a role whose demands ripple outward into every corner of domestic life. She spoke of being overwhelmed by the practicalities, by the suddenness of everything changing, the subtle cadence of daily life, rides, errands, dinners, children's bedtime, was replaced by unknown schedules, invisible handlers, flashed lights, protocol. And in that slip from familiar to unfamiliar, she encountered an emotional toll, one of alienation, of quietly asking whether what she signed up for was still what she was getting. In the background of all this is the deep divergence in their backgrounds and worldviews. Usha's upbringing in a suburban middle-class Indian American household, her path through Yale, Cambridge, and top law firms. JD's upbringing in the Rust Belt, marked by trauma, class decline, emotional landmines. Their intellectual compatibility may have masked the emotional work required to reconcile two very different emotional toolkits. When one partner carries trauma, the other must often assume navigation of it, or risk being left behind. Usha observed that where JD may have been battling his demons, she was contending with the question of how to stand alongside him while not losing herself in the process. The extraction of self into being the spouse of, rather than the partner with, became a hazard. While neither sought traditional limelight in the early years, the spotlight came calling. The marriage entered the glare of political theater. Usha found that she could no longer act only as lawyer or mother homespun, but now as surrogate icon, as symbol of reach and diversity, first Indian American, first Hindu second lady, yet such symbolic status carries its own weight, the expectation to perform, to smile, to stand in solidarity, even when the interior life is unsettled. She became a public face, but privately she felt the risk of invisibility. Public applause masked the Monday mornings of exhaustion, the infrequent moments of private reflection, the feeling of being on while yearning to just be. The demands of high office further strained what might have been a quieter marriage. The vice president role is not merely political, it is existential. It calls for a kind of availability and presence that is nearly constant. Attending events, giving speeches, riding the rails of communications and optics. Usha's role changed from accomplished litigator to almost full-time caretaker of their public-facing family life, often with little recourse to downtime. The domestic sphere she once controlled now was eroded by cameras, aides, and obligations. She spoke of how her husband's world became a lonely sphere despite all the company around him, and by extension how her own partner sometimes became a man she barely connected with in the way they once did. Texts across the day in place of dinner talks. Shared worries filtered through staff briefings instead of whispered in the kitchen. That loneliness spreads into the marriage, turning into quiet resentment. The feeling of growing apart while still sitting side by side. Another dimension of hardship came from the clash between ambition and identity. Usha had built a professional identity that extended beyond being the wife of. She was the clerk, the lawyer, the scholar. She willingly stepped back to focus on family when JD's political ambitions accelerated. But that sacrifice came with cost. In stepping away, she faced the implicit question of what was next for her. Seeing the professional self sidelined, the intellectual space shrinking, the partner in the marriage simultaneously becoming more public and more distant, she had to reconcile the loss of autonomy with the role of supportive spouse. Such tension between personal career trajectory and marital duty is a stress point for many couples, but when one spouse becomes a national figure, the stakes intensify. Within the marriage, the emotional labor shifted disproportionately. Usha increasingly carried the weight of navigating cultural division, being Indian American, Hindu, married to a man prominent in conservative politics. She faced confusion from outside commentators, coded attacks, questions about her loyalty or identity. Meanwhile, the internal dimension, the micro moments of management, of holding space for her husband's ambition while holding on to her children, her home, her origins, became a hidden burden. She became the translator of two worlds, the world of her husband's politics and the world of her own heritage, and found that translation exhausting. In marriage, this kind of hidden work rarely gets acknowledged. She found herself asking where her voice was, and whether supporting JD's trajectory meant erasing or silencing parts of who she was. Marriage also means negotiation and alignment around core life decisions. One such decision, family size, emerged as a flashpoint. Usha revealed that while both partners agreed originally on having children, in the nuance of their discussions she realized they diverged. She believed her role was done after 3 children, while he remained open to more. That divergence may seem small to an outsider, but in the private negotiation of marriage, it becomes symbolic of larger misalignments: ambition, timing, control, mutual understanding. When one partner pushes forward and the other wants to pause, the marriage tilts. Add to that the pressure of public roles, the children carry extra weight as flagships, and the choice of how many becomes less a personal preference and more a signal of stability. Recognition of the marriage's fragility came in indirect ways. Usha's comments on the lack of consultation about her husband's nomination were telling. She learned about a major transition in her life only minutes before it was publicly announced. For a spouse, a partner, to be so marginalized in a decision of such magnitude yields a feeling of being sidelined. That she felt just overwhelmed with the practicalities speaks to the shock of being treated as an accessory rather than an equal decision-maker. This dynamic echoes into daily life. When decisions of consequence are made without joint deliberation, the marriage shifts into a dynamic of leader and follower rather than equal partners. Behind the scenes, the pattern of unshared burdens formed a kind of silent erosion. She worried about the children, about the home, about the legacy of a footnote existence. She carried the worry that the identity of wife of the vice president could come to eclipse the identity of woman in her own right. The mental equation of partner plus public role minus personal autonomy equaled stress. She found herself living in a house full of people, staff, security, media, yet feeling isolated. Where once a marriage offered refuge, now it offered demands. The very institution meant to nurture became one to survive. The implications of her revelation are significant. Her account shines a spotlight on how political ambition can warp personal relationships, not through malicious intent, but through sheer force of transition. It raises questions. How does a marriage survive when one half leaps into power and the other is expected to step in behind? What happens to the person who sacrifices a career or identity for joint ambition? How does recognition voice agency fare when you become the spouse of rather than a partner with? Her voice here is a cautionary tale about the fragility of support roles in asymmetrical trajectories. It also signals the gender dynamics at play. Usha's experience reflects how modern elite marriages still fall into old patterns. Wife takes back seat, husband takes spotlight, the home becomes the wife's domain. But now with higher stakes. Global platform, perpetual cameras, deriding commentary. The marriage becomes not just a union, but a stage. The fact that she felt only faint recognition for her role, not just as mother but as intellectual, speaks of an imbalance in recognition rather than performance. Her hardship emerges not purely from betrayal or disagreement, but from an unspoken contract broken. The contract that said "we together" replaced silently by "you lead, I follow." Given Usha's background as accomplished lawyer and independent thinker, the personal cost of this transition must be heavy. She understood early on that marrying JD meant aligning with his path. She believed in him. She chose him. But belief and choice aren't the same as consent to the way the journey unfolded. Her initial enthusiasm gave way to realization that the path would twist far beyond what she imagined, and that the twist did not include her fully. To feel sidelined in the narrative you helped shape is heartbreak of a particular fashion. Quiet, dignified, yet deeply wounding. The exposure of this hardship also poses implications for how spouses of powerful figures manage their own identities. Usha's words force a reckoning with the expectation that wives will quietly adjust without complaint. The marriage of powerful persons often doesn't get seen from the inside. What appears as smooth unity may conceal strain. Her revelation suggests many more couples in high-demand roles may carry hidden burdens, the cost of being publicly inseparable while privately misaligned. The hidden nature of her struggle, to prefer normalcy, to value quiet dinners, to want untagged family time, is itself an indictment of the unnaturalness of life in power. She reportedly pointed to a moment at dinner when she told her husband, "This is what our life should actually be like." The simple longing for a dinner without cameras, without expectation, without the world watching speaks to how far the marriage had drifted. When a spouse yearns publicly for normal, it means the extraordinary has overtaken the personal. That yearning becomes a form of resistance to the structure they did not sign up for, but one they are still living. Equally significant is the fact that this revelation comes not as a dramatic exposé, but as subtle admission. There are no sensational accusations, rather a sober recounting of dislocation, of emotional misfit, of slow drift. That subtlety underscores perhaps the most painful truth, that marriages in public life often fail not with fireworks, but with quiet resignation. Usha's decision to speak at all breaks the code of silence many political spouses adhere to. Her willingness to acknowledge discomfort gives voice to the many who suffer similarly in the shadows of ambition. Her story raises questions for the broader institution of marriage under power. Is it realistic to expect two individuals to traverse sudden elevation without damage? Can a relationship survive when one partner becomes not just spouse but symbol? What mechanisms exist for preserving partnership when the agenda shifts from family to country? Usha's hardship suggests the answer is only if intention remains and agency is shared. Otherwise, the marriage becomes collateral in ambition. For JD, this revelation means his role as husband will forever carry an additional dimension: accountability. He is no longer only responsible for public office, but for the private world he co-inhabits. The admission of his raising his voice at home, that his wife felt out of the loop, that his partner felt overwhelmed, all become markers of strain. The public may interpret his success as inclusive, but the private cost is now visible. In political marriages, public victories often overshadow private losses. But Usha has pierced that veil. The to-do list for couples in high-stakes environments becomes clearer. Communication needs to be constant. Agency must be mutual. Identity must be preserved. Transitions must be negotiated, not simply absorbed. Usha's hardship is a signal to those watching that the price of ambition may not be just in time, but in selfhood, that partnership may falter not for lack of love, but for lack of alignment. Her revelation does not indict JD nor celebrate her as martyr. It simply holds up a mirror to the realities of marriage under pressure. The enduring implication is this: the union that once seemed secure can be unsettled not by external enemy, but by internal drift. The shared aspirations that once bonded can, when unexamined, pull apart at the seams of expectation. The daylight carrying her answer to unknown questions still lingered when it became clear that what Usha Vance faced in her marriage to JD Vance was not simply the normal trials of partnership, but a metamorphosis of roles, identities, and terrain that neither had quite anticipated. As she revealed her hardships, a reflection emerged. This was a union reshaped by power, prestige, and conflicting personal histories. The story that unfolded was one of transformation and of the unexpected cost for the person standing beside the prominent man. At the moment their lives irrevocably changed, Usha found herself at a threshold where familiar touchpoints vanished. The home they had shared, The routines once comfortable, the career she had carved, each began to blur under the spotlight. She described feeling as though she were losing the reference points she had used to navigate life. The informal evenings when she could focus on her profession, when she could choose clients and set the tempo of her day, those were gone. Instead came a schedule she did not negotiate, roles she did not voluntarily step into. She encountered a kind of passive drift. Decisions about where they lived, how the children would be scheduled, when public appearances would happen, all orchestrated without her active input. In that drift, the marriage tilted, where once she felt equal, she began to feel secondary. For Usha, the hardest hours were the ones that didn't look hard at all, waiting in the living room until the call came, being the one coordinating logistics while acknowledging no one was coordinating for her. Observations she made in private revealed that she was living in the margins of her own marriage. She handled the subtler shifts, finding the right dress for a state dinner, calculating how the children's schooling would adjust to the whirlwind of travel, managing the emotional balance of the home when the head of the household was perpetually elsewhere. The enrichment of her earlier days, the law firm, the briefings, the attentiveness to argument and logic, morphed into something more like buffering and adaptation. A skilled litigator became a long-suffering partner. The pressure of public expectation is seldom obvious in diagnosis, but Usha felt it acutely. She had grown up in a family that prized intellectual accomplishment and service among immigrant parents who modeled discipline and faith. When she married JD, the promise seemed to be two ambitious professionals building a life together, stronger for what each would bring. Yet as he rose, from law school surroundings into Senate life into the vice presidency, her role did not magnify in the same way. The husband's public image amplified, hers remained muted. The inequality of visibility produced an imbalance of power and recognition. While she was praised publicly for her presence, privately she felt overlooked. The personal conversation she thought she would have with him about their future turned sparse and peripheral. Among the more visceral pains she described was the sensation of being the interior voice in the relationship while he became the exterior figure. When he stood on stage, when the cameras tracked him, she was expected to reflect approval, to hold together the family unit, to keep the equilibrium constant. But when the stage was over, later that night, in a hotel room far from home, with children yawning, suitcases unpacked, the version of him she knew seemed to vanish. There was less time for shared meaning, less space for the private companionship that originally bound them. She began to crave a partnership rather than an arrangement. The schedule, the optics, the engagements, all became mechanisms by which they drifted apart. That divergence also stemmed from conceptions of identity. Usha came from a Telugu Indian immigrant family steeped in academic achievement and cultural ritual. JD came from a very different milieu, a childhood of disruption, trauma, class decline in the American Rust Belt. The two met in one world, Yale Law School, but the outside worlds they carried with them were divergent. Over time, she became aware that their emotional toolkits did not map onto the same topology. He leaned on her for stabilization. She became caretaker not just of children and an apartment, but of the emotional aftermath of his public persona. She found herself toggling between two sets of expectations, maintaining her roots, adopting the obligations of his emerging platform, and that toggle felt less like collaboration, more like compromise. In the marriage, she sacrificed more than she perhaps realized. She relinquished commitments to her legal career, setting aside a path that had offered autonomy and voice. She accepted a role of support, of background, of enabling. The result was not only a contraction of her professional sphere, but a contraction of self. Her narrative shifted from, "I am a lawyer with work I choose," to "I am spouse of a man with work I follow." Within that subtle shift lay the heart of her suffering, the mismatch between intention and reality, between earlier self-definition and current expectation. It is telling that she framed some of her hardship not as dramatic scandal, but as a consistent undercurrent. It was the stew of everyday frustration, the feeling of being sidestepped in decisions, the late evenings when the children's needs came after press commitments, the long drives when conversations were absent or filtered through aides, the vacations truncated by protocol. In each instance, she felt the friction between her private world and the public machine, and that friction wore on the sense of mutuality which had once sustained the relationship. Her story speaks to the broader issue of agency in relationships where power becomes uneven. When one partner's trajectory accelerates rapidly, the other can become collateral in that journey. Usha's experience shows how that acceleration can transform a marriage into something more like a ledger, a tally of contributions, of sacrifices, of unsaid resentments. She lived in the middle of that ledger, and in doing so, she gradually lost sight of how to renegotiate what she deserved: voice, presence, acknowledgement. She realized that the institution of marriage, when introduced to grand ambition, requires far more than affection. It requires constant recalibration of roles, of identity, of shared direction. What she revealed also carries implications for power couples everywhere. It suggests that when a couple enters the arena of high-demand public life, the partnership cannot rely on the same rules as two private actors. The context changes. The gravity is heavier. The partner must adapt to new rhythms, new distances, new expectations, and adaptation without dialogue becomes erosion. Usha's hardship is partly a caution. That unaddressed drift becomes its own form of betrayal. The emotional landscape she described is layered. She did not say she was wronged in some egregious way. No dramatic conflagrations of infidelity or betrayal. Rather, she described being adrift. That vertigo of not being anchored in the world you thought you were sharing is often harder to recover from than loud conflict. In quiet moments, she realized she was no longer walking beside him. Instead, she was walking parallel, or sometimes behind, waiting for instruction or recognition. In that waiting, the self begins to hollow out. The person who once interjected, who argued, who built a case, now waits for the next step. In her story, we can see the cost of visibility for the spouse of the visible man. The partner is not only the spouse, but the component of his image. Usha's Indian heritage, her career, her intellect, all became a part of the narrative they projected. She was the difference maker in the campaign, the symbol of immigrant success, the first Hindu second lady, the first Asian American in that role. Yet being the symbol did not protect her from the sidelining of her personhood. In fact, the symbolic function placed extra pressure to conform, to hold still, to not rock the boat, while internally she felt the keel shift. The marriage also suffered a temporal dimension, the acceleration and the pause. His rise reached a velocity she could not match nor steer. She paused her career, she paused many expectations of herself. But there was no pause for the marriage, for the transformation. The machine of politics, of optics, of power moved forward at its own pace. She was embedded within that machine but lost the steering wheel. That temporal mismatch, her life in slow rewind while his ran at full speed, was a terrain of hardship she lived through. Her experience holds a mirror to the unspoken contract of marriage that we navigate together. But when one partner's calling takes him outward so radically, the contract morphs. The promise of companionship becomes tethers of utility. The promise of equality becomes shadows of support. The promise of shared voice becomes echoes of someone else's stage. For Usha, this became a crisis of expectation, and then a crisis of being. Realizing that you have traded a promising professional identity for a role whose terms you did not fully accept is painful. But perhaps what's worse is realizing it slowly in sleepless hours in mounting silence. She also revealed the emotional complication of belonging and not belonging simultaneously. As the wife of the vice president, she inhabited one world. As Usha Chilukuri, daughter of immigrants and high-powered attorney, she belonged to another. Those worlds collided. In the first, she was cast in the role of political spouse. In the second, she could still remember the early morning lectures, the law review deadlines, the research in Cambridge. She had to leave part of that other world behind, but never quite staged a farewell. The fracture between those two selves is at the heart of her hardship. And yet, in speaking of her experience, she opened a quieter kind of power. She gave voice not to anger, but to awareness. She reclaimed the narrative of her side of the marriage. In doing so, she forced a reckoning. There is no default path for a spouse when the other partner becomes extraordinary. There must be conversations, renegotiations, and mutual recognition, or the marriage becomes unrecognizable. Her hardship becomes lesson, that the romance of ambition must be balanced by the ritual of togetherness. To consider what this means is painful, but necessary. For anyone in a relationship where one partner's rise upends the other's world, the questions her pain raises are real. Are we still partners when the itinerary changes? Do we consult before we leap? Is success permitted to one but not allowed to shift the home? Does ambition always include the spouse? Usha's hardship suggests the answer. It must, or the marriage will bear the cost. Her revelation is not intended to scandalize, but to normalize. She shows that it is permissible for the spouse of somebody prominent to feel lost. That visibility does not equal agency. That supporting does not erase needing. And perhaps most importantly, she reminds that marriage is not a spectator sport. Even when the world watches, the pair must watch each other. In the arc of their relationship, the implications stretch beyond their household. They ripple into the idea of what a political marriage is. They shift perceptions of how spouses behave in power. They expose the invisible labor that underpins public lives. They complicate the narrative of power couple by showing how power can be distributed asymmetrically. Usha's hardship is the human counterpoint to the team victory, the backstage hero unacknowledged. What she laid bare was the mismatch between image and interior, between platform and partnership. And in doing so, she reclaimed the notion that hardship doesn't only arrive via visible crisis, it weaves itself in the unseen corners, in the unspoken modifications, in the resignations to small betrayals of self. Her story matters because it is not only hers. It belongs to anyone who has stood beside someone rising, who has asked quietly, "What about my rise?" and found no answer. The revelation leaves an imprint. It erodes the illusion that such marriages are seamless. It alerts us to the price paid by the spouses and invites a kinder gaze on the people behind the public person. Usha's hardship is a story of identity met by ambition, of partnership met by optics, of love met by sacrifice. It is a story demanding that we ask of ourselves, what does commitment require? What does success cost? And perhaps, what are we willing to lose or keep in the name of someone else's ascent? As Usha Vance continued to lift the veil on her experiences, a deeper emotional texture emerged, one defined not only by exhaustion, but by awakening. Beneath the quiet grief of lost autonomy was the realization that she had spent years functioning as the stabilizing current beneath someone else's storm. It was a role that demanded patience and precision, the careful management of optics and tone, yet one that rarely acknowledged its cost. She had lived through a constant state of translation, translating emotion into poise, uncertainty into reassurance, and frustration into composure. That emotional translation became both her armor and her burden. What made her hardship particularly resonant was its universality disguised within exceptional circumstances. Millions of partners experience this invisible erosion, the gradual shift from being an equal participant to being a pillar that supports another's climb. But in her case, the climb was monumental, and so was the weight placed upon her. Each public appearance required performance. The steady smile, the reassuring presence, the elegant silence. The discipline of composure became second nature, even as her internal dialogue grew louder. Within that silence was a yearning not for sympathy but for recognition, an acknowledgement that endurance too is a form of contribution. Her reflections carried the cadence of someone who had come to understand that hardship in marriage does not always manifest as conflict. It can arrive through absence, imbalance, and invisibility. There was no single moment of rupture, no sharp betrayal or argument that ended the illusion of partnership, but rather an accumulation of missed conversations, postponed reassurances, and the simple ache of being unheard. Usha's words revealed how love can coexist with loneliness, how commitment can endure even when joy flickers uncertainly. It was a portrait of endurance shaped by dignity, not bitterness. The symbolism of her revelation extended beyond her personal story into the fabric of political culture itself. Her openness suggested that behind every immaculate image of national leadership lies an ecosystem of unspoken compromises, and behind every polished couple photo is a choreography of restraint. Usha's hardship called into question the myth of perfect composure that politics often demands from those adjacent to power. By voicing her struggle, she redefined what strength looks like. Not the stoic silence of endurance, but the quiet courage to name discomfort in a world that prefers denial. It also illuminated how gendered expectations still shadow modern relationships. Even within a marriage of two high-achieving individuals, social norms positioned her in the background. her worth measured by how seamlessly she could enhance her husband's image. Her hardship exposed how systemic this dynamic remains. The presumption that a woman's success must fold itself neatly into her partner's ambition, that her resilience should remain invisible. Her truth, once spoken, punctured that illusion with quiet precision. In revealing the reality of her hardship, Usha Vance transformed her silence into a kind of authorship. The narrative that once belonged solely to others, to campaign strategists, journalists, admirers, was reclaimed as her own. Through that act of articulation, she restored balance not by rewriting her marriage, but by reasserting her humanity within it. Her story endures as a reminder that beneath titles, ceremony, and image, there remains a person seeking recognition not as a role, but as a self, whole, weary, and still unyieldingly real. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Usha Vance revealing her marriage hardships with JD Vance? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.